This is the Gen Z Climate Being podcast. I'm Rachel, and today I am in climate conversation with Bonita Eloise Ford. Bonita is an author and educator who supports people in addressing and responding to eco/climate breakdown. Her book, Embers of Hope Embracing Life in an Age of Ecological Destruction and Climate Chaos, was listed as one of the top 20 best all time permaculture books by women. Her new book, Climate Care, is set for publication in spring 2027. Bonita is currently Climate Mental Health Network's Gen Z program lead, and she has led groups around the world for over 20 years. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us again. My name is Rachel, and I am here today in conversation with Bonita, and I would love to give you the opportunity to introduce yourself in whatever way feels right in the moment.
Thank you, Rachel. So my name is Bonita Eloise Ford, and I am so many things in my life, and I think today I am a human being who speaks for the water and for the land. I'm an author, so I have a book called Embers of Hope. Give it here. Embers of Hope, Embracing Life in an Age of Ecological Destruction and Climate Chaos. And I'll have a new book for middle school readers coming out in 2027 called Climate Care. And I'm also very, very grateful to be the Gen Z program lead for Climate Mental Health Network. I've also taught permaculture for most of the last decade, and I'm a big gardener, and yeah, just so many things. And these are just some of the bright ones that are floating around in me today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing. I love how you started by saying you're just a being, because I think so often in our introductions of who we are, we start with what we do, our job, and I'm constantly having to remind myself, like, we're human beings, we're not human doings.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
enough to just be. So I really
agreed.
appreciate that. So I want to begin with talking about what does climate change mean to you? And did you think about climate change in a different way when you were younger, and how this has kind of evolved for you and changed over the years?
I really like the question. When I think back to being in elementary school, I remember learning the about endangered species and species kind of on the brink of extinction, and I remember learning about the ozone layer, and climate was kind of more on the periphery at the time. But I remember being really concerned already about the things that I learned. And as I grew older, so I studied. I loved science so much. I wanted to become a science teacher. Um, and after doing my bachelor's degree, I went and did a master's degree. And in that period, I was involved with a group of students and professors at the university where I was at, and we started an educational sustainability garden because we wanted to bring more students from our university out onto the land to be growing food together, and have that experience and have that learning process be part of to really be more integrated into what we were learning in the classroom around holistic health. And so for me, it was in that period that I also started learning permaculture. And and in that, I'd say, in that few years of diving more into the permaculture community and becoming more engaged in the community, I began to really understand more and more the scale of the ecological crisis that we're in,
Mhm.
of which climate is one really big part.
Mhm.
And when I started teaching permaculture around 2011, 2012, we were also involved in starting a transition town project in the community where we live now. And transition towns are really built, or at the time, we were, I think, really focused on the idea of trying to kind of address the crises of peak oil and climate change. And so I'd say, like, really in the last decade, climate has become really an increasingly central part of my life. And then with launching my book back in 2020, I've really, the climate space has become my living room. It's become my main focus. And so been, it's been kind of a gently evolving, unfolding journey.
Mhm.
And I'm so, and I guess, and so to your question of what does it mean to me, I think at this point in my life, especially given everything that's going on in the world, and I'm thinking about a proposed development in our local community at a significant wetland, and I'm thinking about the political climate in the US as well as in Canada.
Mhm.
And I think climate for me has become, it's kind of one frame, one filter for helping me really realize how much our world and our societies and our civilizations are changing, and how much my own assumptions are changing and continue to have to change, and how my relationships with Mother Earth and with my community and how my engagement in community, how all of that has changed quite rapidly and will continue to have to change quite rapidly. So
Mhm.
it's, in a way, I think it's, if we can point to it as a thing, we can frame it as parts per million of carbon in the atmosphere, or we can think of it as 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees or 3 degrees. Um, and for me, it's so much more than that. Like, I think those are we have kind of finite ways that we can point to the problem, and then I think there are so many aspects of our lives that it touches and encompasses, and it's especially at this time in the world, I feel so rocked, so moved, and so called to take deeper responsibility, because it's, I think, my own inner sense of responsibility and what I feel called to in this past year is so much more and more deep than it was even 5 years ago. I think maybe because we're seeing, and I am understanding more personally, just the social repercussions of these things that we might label or measure in parts per million or in degrees, but it's just like, wow, this is impacting communities, this is impacting people, this is impacting um, people who have had it hard and will have it harder.
Mhm.
And so, in a way, it's also it's a calling.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for that. I really appreciate kind of like looking at climate as this framing and this filter, because it's like in my own experience of learning about climate change, I was really taught through this framing of the parts per million and this very like abstracted distance, like something in the atmosphere kind of separate from us. Um, and I think now seeing climate as this expression of the cultural systems and stories that we live in and
Yes.
how those are projected onto
Yeah.
the land and bodies and this deep interconnection
Hmm.
between everything really changed my understanding of the world, of
Yeah.
myself in the world. Um, it really changed everything for me. And you mentioned permaculture, and I know that's a really significant part of your life and way you think about the world. And I'm wondering, for those, first of all, who don't know what permaculture is, do you
Hmm.
mind just giving like a brief overview of that and maybe how that thinking also maybe contributes to your understanding of how you frame climate?
Hmm. So, permaculture, the way I learned it and the way I practice it and have taught it, I think of it as ecological design. And it's about looking to living systems as our teachers and trying to, and from the principles that we learn through the observation of natural systems, applying that applying those principles to our planning processes, applying those principles to our decision making processes. And so, whether we are planning and designing a garden, or whether we're designing a course curriculum, or whether we're designing an event or an organization, we can take those same principles and have that guide us in our thinking to be more to help us just be more harmonious,
Hmm.
to be like to have more of a to be more efficient with how we how we use our time and energy, and with how we connect different aspects of what we do to try and have it's so permaculture, I think, in a nutshell, it's a holistic approach to design.
Hmm.
And so just really trying to have whatever we are designing. And a lot of people think about permaculture as designing gardens or designing farms or designing physical landscapes. And a lot of permaculture design is applied in those areas. And I've also been really interested in social design. And for me also, permaculture was my first doorway or invitation to listen to the land. I didn't grow up with that. I always imagine or try to imagine what it would have been like to have grown up in the village that my grandparents grew up in. Like I just wonder like what would that feel like to be in the place where their ancestors were buried and where they were born and where they grew up, and I didn't have that. And so permaculture was and so the way I also describe permaculture sometimes is that it is it's a system, it's a toolkit for people like me who grew up in this mainstream dominant paradigm that we're not taught how to meet our basic needs
Hmm.
for food, for housing, for transportation, for livelihood, for community in a way that's in harmony with the natural and the living world.
Hmm.
And so I was really I had the gift of it was such a gift to have there was an indigenous teacher, Marcelo Saavedra Vargas, that I met, I don't know, maybe back in 2011, 2012. And he soon became a friend. He was just such a beautiful, beautiful man and such a gift to the community. And what I learned from him, so he invited me to give an intro to permaculture talk at his, he taught at one of the universities in Ottawa. So he asked me to give a talk at one of his classes. And so I did, and then the two of us went out for lunch afterwards. And he said to me when we were, just the two of us chatting over lunch, he said, so much of what you talked about is inherent in the culture of my people. Like we didn't necessarily use the same words, but in our cultural teachings, in our stories, in our traditions, the teachings that you expressed as permaculture principles, like that's embedded in our way of being as Indigenous people. And that really stuck with me, um, because it was and so it just brings me back to this idea that permaculture was that first doorway in for me of really learning to have a an embedded, integrated living relationship with the land that I'm on,
Mhm.
to listen, to be humble, and to be part of this living community that is more than people.
Yeah, that was beautiful.
Mm.
Thank you. And I really love this idea too of thinking about permaculture as this way of thinking and being that can
Hmm.
be applied to so many things. Like you mentioned climate education. Like, what if we applied permaculture thinking
Hmm.
to systems design in so many facets of our
Hmm.
society? Also reminds me of the way that author, let's see if I remember, Machado de Oliveira, I believe, wrote Hospicing Modernity and talks
Mm.
about colonialism, climate change as this atrophy of relationship and the
Mm.
senses. And it really feels
Mm.
like permaculture is a way to really root into those things.
Mm.
So
Hmm.
I'm gonna think about more ways to incorporate that into my life, even if
Hmm.
I'm not able to have a garden. But like we're saying, there's so many ways to
Hmm.
incorporate that. So thank you
Of course.
for sharing that. So in talking about climate change and ecological disaster and collapse, and there's just so much. We're living in this time poly crisis, where there is such this atrophy of senses and relationship. I'm wondering for you, and also I'll mention,
Hmm.
right, like we both work for part of the Climate Mental Health Network, and so we are also very concerned about the way climate impacts mental health
Hmm.
and emotions and the kind of mental body spiritual facet
Hmm.
of us as human beings. And I'm wondering for you, is there a memory, a story, a piece of art that you turn to reconnect with your body? And I would assume gardening is one of those pieces for you. But yeah, I was wondering if there's other things that come to
Hmm.
mind.
Hmm. Thank you for that. So one thing I would love to share is about, so the last 4 years in the summer I've been participating in a water walk ceremony with, led by an Indigenous Anishinaabe grandmother here in the area that we've been dear friends with for a number of years. And it's been such a, it's been, it's changed so much in me and deepened so much in me in my daily life. And I think part of it is that, so this ceremony, so in this ceremony we are, it's a, the ceremony takes place on the side of the road. Like we are walking on the side of highways. Um, and my first year walking, on my first day, my first couple of days, I remember having this, just feeling so torn in me. Like part of me was just feeling so grateful to be in this sacred space, carrying this. It's also a relay ceremony. So we basically, the water walker and the staff carrier, basically we walk in pairs, and we one person will carry the water, and then one person will carry the staff, and then we'll pass it off to another pair ahead of us. And so maybe the people are, roughly, let's say, half a mile ahead of us. And so it was just such a beautiful walking meditation
Mhm.
outdoors. And I remember just feeling so torn, because what part of me was just feeling so nourished and just loving this connection to the water and to the land and being out with the trees. And part of me was so resistant to doing this ceremony on the side of the highway. And so
Mhm.
part of me was like, why do we do this here? Like, why are we not doing this and just, walking along a river in the forest for hours or days? And I was talking with a friend who had walked for a few years before me. And what I understood from her was that that was part of part of the lesson for her, and such a deep lesson for me that I continue to try and integrate into my daily life, is that I I have this kind of inner bias, or I have this idea in me that some things are sacred and some things are not.
Mhm.
I have this idea that I go and sit in meditation, or I go and attend ceremony,
Mhm.
and that I step out of my regular life, that when I'm doing accounting, that is not sacred.
Mhm.
And that when I'm doing these other things, they are. And I
Mhm.
think in my 4 year, well, especially in that first year of the water walk, and I've really been trying to practice this understanding as I've been in the last 3 years, more and more in my regular life between the walks, and trying to really affirm that when I'm on the walk, is that all of it is sacred
Mhm.
all the time. Like, it's my human judgment that I think that accounting is not sacred, and that me being in silent meditation, or me fasting, is sacred. Fasting in the woods, but accounting, like, that's my judgment.
Yeah.
And so having and so I think part of what that's meant for me is that it's I've been, especially in this last year, feeling more, just having this inner calling and feeling more inspired to integrate my activism with my spiritual life.
Mhm.
And and so, when I think about the challenges that the living in a time of polycrisis, and being bombarded by news and social media, and just the intensity of that, for me, in taking care of my own mental health, one thing that really helps me is walking, just in my regular life. And so I started singing while I go out on my regular walks. And then I also, last year, at the wetland that I'm working to with others in our community to try and protect, I I I saw beavers at the wetland, and so I started singing to the beavers. And one of the beavers, um, one of the beavers seemed really interested. And so it was one beaver in particular. I call her Curious. I don't know if they're a she or he. Anyways, I called them Curious, and I recognized them by their color, the color of their fur, and also that when I would sing to them, that this one beaver, that Curious, would actually circle in front of me in the water, and would drop what they were doing, and come and just circle and listen. And so for me, it's been this very humbling, real, and also sacred reminder that all of these things blur, or that they can blur, that I don't have to have any separation between doing my self care, trying to befriend the local wildlife, and trying to protect an ecosystem that is a really important part of the well-being of the long-term well-being of the community where I live, and that there doesn't have to be a separation. And so that helps me reconnect to my body, and that helps me reconnect to this place, and that helps me engage in my activism in a way that really nourishes me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So singing to beavers, I recommend it.
Yes. For me, it's hummingbirds. I
Yes.
feel like I have a
Oh,
special relationship with hummingbirds. Actually, just
oh,
love hummingbirds. It's just
oh,
food.
yes.
Um,
Yes, yes,
but
yes, yes,
hearing their
yes.
little like song and
Yes.
they'll like hover and we'll make eye contact.
Yeah.
I think it's just such a good reminder that we are part of the ecosystem
Hmm.
and like this conversation of sacred versus not sacred, and it reminds me a lot of coming to understand that like environment is not this thing that's like over there, right?
Hmm.
It's not just the green forest
Yeah. Yeah.
um that you travel to. Like it really is everything. Like
Yeah.
there is I don't know, I kind of view like every space as environment, and it's like in expanding that definition, then how does it expand what it means to partake in environmental action, partake in
Hmm.
in climate action, and it just I think leads to so much more possibilities. And by, like you said, blurring this
Hmm.
line between sacred and not sacred, it makes us realize like we're all part of sacred life, and
Hmm.
we're all part of this. So
Hmm. Hmm.
thank you for that reminder. And oh, the water walk just sounds absolutely magical. I would love to participate in something like
Please
that.
come.
Yeah.
We'll be walking again this summer. It'll be a
Amazing.
couple of weeks this summer. Yeah.
Oh, very cool.
Hmm.
Um, so this, I feel like this question fits nicely with our conversation of what emotion moves you? I
Mm.
think we're all moved by different emotions and feelings. I know for me, rage and anger can
Mm.
be somewhat numbing for me sometimes.
Hmm.
I can often go into a bit of paralysis, and I've learned for me that I feel really moved into taking external action through joy and excitement. And I think obviously each emotion has a place, but I'm I'm curious like what place you have to kind of enter or be in to move into the world.
Mm. I love that. So I think for me, I think grief and sadness are the main emotion that brings me into, I was going to say this work, but it's such a central emotion in my life, and it's behind so much of what I do. And I think even as a child, just even sadness around the idea that poverty existed and that there were children like me that didn't have enough to eat. Like even having that very basic awareness was enough to have me just I had this underlying kind of sense of sadness around around Christmas, which we celebrated in my family, and knowing that I had that we received gifts and that we had lots of toys and we had plenty to eat and that other people didn't.
Hmm.
Um, And so I think, and so, going from that place, growing beyond that little person's kind of small slice of the world, and growing beyond my own spirituality, growing beyond Christianity, my understanding of the world, growing beyond, like, wow, there's so many other things in the world that are unjust and
Mhm.
terrible and horrible, that go beyond poverty, and the reasons behind those things. And so I think, so sadness has been at the root of so much for me.
Mhm.
And part of, I think, what really brought me into the climate space, and so I write about this in my book, Embers of Hope, is that I had a friend, it was around 2012, it was a dear friend who was diagnosed with a life-threatening, she received she had a life-threatening or a terminal diagnosis, and she was not really sure whether or not she believed it. She received this information with a lot of uncertainty about what it meant and how she wanted to live. And I just, being a close person in her life and being a part of her small circle of support, really, it just taught me so much about being with uncertainty and being with our own mortality, and just how she experienced so many different emotions, and how could she could really focus on doing her best to heal,
Mhm.
to have gratitude for every small thing in a day, and to continue to try and give back to her community. And so as she was going through this process of trying to heal, not sure if she was dying, she was also she also redid her power of attorney papers and her will, and so she was holding both, and at the same time, like, this sense of just living with such a sense of fullness, trying to change and trying to change everything that she could in her life to bring it in the direction that she was hoping for, and to be enriching her own life, to be enriching the lives of the people around her, the communities around her, and also learning to make peace with the end. And that whole journey with her, supporting her in that process, accompanying her in her dying process, that became such a personal metaphor for how I want to live in through the poly crisis.
Mhm.
And so just this piece around grief and learning to, and it's a practice, right? Like, for me, it's not an endpoint. It's about learning to be open to my grief, to be present with my grief, to let that break my heart open,
Mhm.
and from there to live my life as fully as possible. And by that, I mean that so much of how I fill my days and weeks is filled with so much meaning, and that's directly connected to how I'm a part of the ecological places and the human communities that I'm a part of. And so it's this mutual enriching, this mutual deepening, this mutual strengthening that 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 I'm practicing, that I'm walking, and grief is a part of that. Grief is part of what drives me, in that I don't think I could do that as well
Mhm.
without my grief. Like it's painful, and it's also a blessing to have my heart cracked open. And
Yeah.
that is the way that I want to live my life, and that is the way I want to build community and engage in my communities and contribute.
Yeah. I think yeah, embracing grief, we really are embracing life. And in embracing death, we really are embracing life. And I think
Absolutely.
that's something, especially I'm in the US and especially this society really struggles with.
Yeah.
Um there's like there's just this big like ick around death and mortality.
Hmm.
Um and I wonder what would change if we um embraced that more
Hmm.
and saw it as a guide. Um, and that's something I'm really working through as well, because I've had death touch my family's
Hmm.
life recently.
Hmm.
Um, and it's led to, like you're saying, as it's led to as many beautiful things as many painful things. It's
Hmm.
both.
Hmm.
Um, and it reminds me too. I think in this society we're kind of taught that like achieving happiness is like the pinnacle, right? That's the goal. It's like to live a happy life, which I don't really know what that means exactly. Um,
Hmm.
but it's like, well, no, I think the goal is to feel everything, like
Hmm.
experience all the emotions, and that happiness isn't, some superior emotion.
Hmm.
So
Yeah,
I,
that makes a lot of sense to me.
yeah.
That really resonates.
Mhm. Yeah. Um, yeah, just sitting with that. I think this is such an important conversation that
Mm.
we need to be having more of, for sure. And my next question,
Actually, can I add something
yeah, of
to that?
course.
Just as you were speaking, another thing that came to me is that, and I think this applies to both our own relationships with our personal mortality, or mortality in a personal way. So the mortality of ourselves and the people around us, and to ecological collapse and the climate crisis. I find, when I think about what I thought, or my relationship with death as a child, and what I thought death was about, or what it meant, it was very much on that spectrum of what you were saying, that, in our society, happiness, having a happy life, is the pinnacle that we're working towards. And so, in a way, in my child's mind, death was kind of it was the thing to be avoided. It was like, I don't know, it was such a
Mhm.
bad, dark, scary, horrifying thing. And in this process with my friend, it was almost like I discovered a magical back door, because I never realized that death could really be a doorway to, like, so for those of us who are left behind, so I'm not talking I'm not talking about an afterlife, whether or not, whether or not we believe in that. That's a whole other conversation, and a beautiful one. And I'm just thinking about those of us who lose a loved one, that loss can lead to, doesn't necessarily, but it can be an invitation that leads us to something, to so much more in our lives, to something so much deeper in our lives. And I've I've experienced that several times around the death of loved ones, and also volunteering with hospice in my community. And so I guess I just want to offer that as a little seed for all of us. And maybe you and I can come back and chat more about it and
Yeah.
have tea another day. It's just, it's like death and loss. I used to think of it as such a bad thing. And it's been one of my most beautiful teachers. And it was almost like the way what I learned, it was almost alchemical. You know, this process, this learning process, this journey with my friend was almost like, I mean, yes, she did die, but somehow it was almost like we cheated the process because we got something bigger and better out of it. It's just, it's very paradoxical, and it doesn't, it's hard to express in words, but just in my heart, I can feel how much I've grown and how much my my heart has grown and expanded in that process of losing her and grieving over her. I'm not saying I don't miss her. I'm not saying it wasn't hard.
Yeah.
And that whole journey, it was almost like I think my life is better for having walked that journey.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Would I choose to lose her? No, but that wasn't my choice and that wasn't her choice. And so when I extrapolate that to the poly crisis, yeah, it sounds like a really big, bad, god awful thing. And so many of us are suffering, and it will continue to get worse.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just looking at it with these, you know, this part of me that kind of having had this experience with multiple people and in the work that I've been doing in the last few years, just having had these experiences, I'm kind of looking at the poly crisis with this, I don't know, like I'm just fumbling around in the dark and reaching for that magical back door. I don't know where it is. Um, and some of the interactions that I've had with people in the last few months and in the last few weeks have been really profound.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not sure that those things would have happened or that people would be um, committing in the ways that they are or stepping up or putting themselves on the line as much as they are if so much wasn't unraveling in the world. So
Yeah. Yeah.
all of
It's a
that.
yeah. No, I think this is a beautiful conversation. I would love to continue. I'm glad we landed here.
Yeah.
And I think in the question of what do you want to presence the most in the future and summon into reality, maybe part of that is this like embracing of this kind of grief dimensionality of life.
Yes. Yes. Absolutely. Absolutely. So much so. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah.
And having my own spiritual life, my own spiritual practices be really deeply integrated in the activism that I'm doing because I think the more I see crisis around me, the more I ramp up into emergency mode, and that's just not sustainable.
Mhm.
Like I can't do emergency mode for weeks and months and years. You know, I can do it for a few days. And we're seeing a lot of crisis at a
Yeah.
larger and larger scale. And so I think that's part of it is for me wanting to presence more, um, just having deeper resources to replenish myself on a regular basis.
Yeah. Absolutely. Has your work with the Gen Zers and being, program lead, um, has that kind of changed or like affected what you want to see in the future? Has it kind
Mm.
of offered you, a new vision, a different vision, or maybe just a deepening into the vision you already have.
Mm,
I'm wondering how that has been, influenced your relationship to
mm.
this all.
Thank you. I I think I'm still learning so much with our Gen Zers. I'm learning so much with them, from them. And part, so one part of it is this is completely anecdotal. Like there's no evidence behind this. There's no empirical research behind this yet. Um, and actually, maybe there is a little bit. I'd have to dig it out. I remember reading something about it, but I would have to dig for it. I think um, I think young people, young activists are more at risk of burning out.
Hmm.
So I remember being in my 20s and definitely struggling with depression, struggling with kind of a sense of like a loss of purpose, a loss of meaning, like just not really understanding how, not really getting how I could live a happy life
Hmm.
given everything that I knew about the world. And I remember struggling. I struggled like about that as a teen. I struggled about that in my 20s.
Yeah.
And so I can relate to that heaviness of looking out at the world and saying, "Oh my God, like what is the point? The problems are so huge and overwhelming, and I am only one person." And I just remember, and I continue to struggle with that. You know, that's never gone away. I just have more, I have, I just hold that with more compassion and more groundedness, and I have more self-care tools than I ever did before, and I have um, deeper relationships and community that I, didn't have when I was 16, for example. And I also think that it's a bit of a powder keg. Like when I think about myself in this very moment, so I think about myself in 2024, the beginning of 2025, I have been actively trying to not burn out. Like this has been the last 12 months, especially more than ever, I have been trying to ramp up my engagement. I was already very involved in my community. I was already involved in activism, and I would say in the last year, it's just the state of the world has, yeah, my activism has moved to a whole other level. It continues to, and at the same time, I am trying so hard not to burn out. So while I am out there trying to engage more, I am also in here trying to engage more and to replenish more and to refill more. And I've had 2 decades of personal experience trying to learn about myself, learning how to take care of myself, learning what it looks like when I hit my walls internally, learning when I just all of that.
Hmm.
But if I try to imagine the sense of kind of desperation and hopelessness and helplessness that I had when I was 16, coupled with the urgency that I experience now, and like not having 2 decades of experience of self-care and, falling down emotionally and finding myself in dark pits emotionally and learning how to extract myself from those dark inner places and learning to heal through that and learning to give myself more of an inner safety net around those things. If I didn't have that experience, it would be so much harder right now. And I think that's really what I've what I'm learning with the Gen Zers is that being, or what I've been seeing is that being in one's late teens or earlier mid 20s and being really aware of the world and sensitive and caring, um, I think it puts I think it puts young activists at a higher risk of burnout
Hmm.
than for activists in their 30s or 40s or 50s who
Yeah.
have more experience, personal experience, community relationships, community networks. And
Hmm.
that's important. Like that's
Yeah.
different. It's different being, it's different finishing high school, um, different finishing college and starting a career now than it was 10 years ago or 20 years ago. And that's hard. That's harder than I can even imagine. And I can't pretend to know what that's like. I try to imagine because I experienced what I experienced when I was in my teens and 20s, and I know what I experience now. And I try and kind of connect the dots and imagine what younger activists are struggling with now. And so I think what it makes me, it humbles me, and it also makes me more determined than ever to create safe spaces for younger activists and to just remind them, teach, share, remind them of simple tools to help them take care of themselves. Because I also remember being in my teens and in my 20s and thinking that I was invincible. I could just keep pushing. It didn't matter, but it did matter, and it does matter for me now too. So, and and creating community spaces, more and more. I think, I mean, that's, I think, one big thing that the cohort that I've been leading in the last year, I think if I had to summarize or encapsulate it in one word, I think it's community. Just
Hmm.
having a space where this group of young women climate leaders could come together with their peers and hear from others that they were struggling with very similar things. And
Hmm.
I think that's having a community of like-minded, like-hearted peers who are engaged in this kind of work. I think it's really important
Hmm.
because
Yeah.
I think our society is can be so isolating,
Hmm.
and we can also, I think, also our I think mainstream North American society also, like mental health stigma can be so isolating. And so I think having community for the purposes of kind of social support, mental health support, and having others to, um, collaborate with in the actions that we might choose to engage in. Um, they're just, and so it goes back to permaculture. And so
Yeah.
for me, community is one of those. It's in permaculture terms, we say stacking functions. So just the
Hmm.
idea that it has multiple functions, and that so that community can have all of these roles. That community care
Hmm.
can be so connected to our earth care, so connected to our self care, and just so essential for our for laying the groundwork for our resilience, because
Hmm.
I think we're starting to see that more and more, that in times of disaster, that it's really the people in walking distance that we turn to. And so those relationships are essential.
Yeah. Yeah. Something I was thinking about when you were sharing too is just this need for more intergenerational
Yeah.
community,
Yeah.
and how there needs to be just more of this transfer and sharing of knowledge between generations, and to hear the stories of young people, of old people. I think we need more systems and structures
Hmm.
that support that, because, you know, there's so many that have been fighting and working for decades.
Mm.
Um, so many ancestors that lived through incredibly hard,
Yeah.
trying
Yeah.
times, and there's this way to that. We need to look at how movements work and how change happens, and the time scale of
Hmm.
all of that, and how it's not linear. Like, it
No.
is a very um chaotic journey.
Hmm.
And so yeah, that's one thing I would like to presence more in the future, is having this intergenerational networks.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, we've come to the end of this conversation, which has been so juicy.
Hmm.
Um, I've really loved it, and I would love to continue. Um, but for this moment in time, is there any last thing you would like to leave us with for today?
Just, I want to encourage all of us, myself included, to to give ourselves permission to rest and pursue joy.
Hmm. Yes, I echo
Because,
that.
yeah, because I think in for those of us that are um, that have a hard time putting this work down, that definitely includes me.
Mhm.
The urgency, it kind of, um, yeah, it's, I have a really, really hard time putting it down. And
Mhm.
so it's actually important to be intentional about putting it down when I'm able to. And it can be simple things, it can be as simple as just stepping outside and feeling the cold air on my face. It can be as simple as going for a walk around the block. Can be as simple as having tea with a friend, whatever it is, just remembering to prioritize those things as well that nurture us, that nourish us,
Yeah.
um, because I think we're in this for the long haul. I think this is a life choice. I think it's a life, well, I don't think the poly crisis is a life choice, but I think to um, answer to the call, I
Mhm.
think that is a life choice. And and I still deeply believe that it's possible to live in meaningful ways and to experience joy and well-being even as we are um, doing our best to meet unraveling and collapse with openness, with honesty, and try to um, support one another and hold each other up.
Yeah. I think letting ourselves be unraveled
Yeah,
sometimes
yeah,
is important, and
yeah.
knowing that what we put down will be there for us when we're ready.
Yes,
So
Yes, 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 yes. Yeah,
thank you so much for your time and your willingness to share and be in conversation with me. I so appreciate it, and to be continued.
of
Thanks.
course.
Thanks
Thank
for
you
listening.
so much. Thank you for having me. And I look forward to having tea and talking about hummingbirds because I
Yes.
love hummingbirds so much. So I'm sure we'll have amazing hummingbird stories to trade.
Yes. I have to make my way to Perth.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, well, yes, yes, you do. And I would love for you to join the water walk. And maybe this is not the best place for hummingbirds. I might see more of them. I know
It's
I
cool.
found more of them when I was in California. So,
Yeah,
but
you can come on down.
yeah. All right. Thank you